Here is where we are. The year is 1618. Central Europe is on fire. Not metaphorically. Literally, villages are burning from Bohemia to Bavaria. Armies are moving across the German countryside, and nobody is quite sure anymore who started it or what winning would even look like. Before it ends, and it will not end for 30 years, somewhere between 8 million and 11 million people will be dead, not from battle alone. From famine, from plague, from the displacement of entire populations driven from their homes by armies that loot and burn, because that is how armies of this era feed themselves. Entire regions of Germany will lose a third of their population. Some areas will lose half. It will be the deadliest conflict in European history until the 20th century, and the historians who study it still argue about its causes, its turning points, and what it ultimately meant. Now here is the question that almost nobody asks when they learn about this war. How did Europe get to a place where 11 million people could die over a question that would have seemed entirely academic to anyone living 150 years earlier? How did a continent that had spent centuries managing religious disagreements, sometimes violently but never at this scale, arrive at a conflict so total, so prolonged, and so catastrophic that it took 30 years and the deaths of a third of Germany's population before anyone could agree to stop? The answer begins in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, sometime around 1440. It begins with a goldsmith who had a debt problem, a mechanical idea, and absolutely no intention of starting a war. His name was Johannes Gutenberg, and what he built was a machine. Not just any machine, a machine that could copy text, specifically a machine that used movable metal type, individual letter-shaped pieces of metal that could be arranged to spell words, locked into a frame coated with ink and pressed against paper or vellum to produce a printed page, and that could then be disassembled and rearranged to print a completely different page. The printing press was not Gutenberg's invention alone. Movable type had existed in China since the 11th century. The screw press mechanism had been used for centuries in winemaking and olive oil production. What Gutenberg contributed was a specific combination of elements: the oil-based ink that adhered properly to metal type rather than beading off it, the adjustable mold that could cast type pieces of precisely varying widths to accommodate different letters, the press mechanism adapted from agricultural tools for the particular mechanical requirements of transferring ink to paper. That made the whole system work at a speed and cost that made mass production of text economically viable for the first time in European history. Before Gutenberg, a book cost roughly the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's annual salary. Producing it required months of labor by a trained scribe, writing out every word by hand in carefully ruled lines on carefully prepared parchment or vellum. Books existed, but they were objects of such expense and rarity that they were owned almost exclusively by institutions, monasteries, universities, royal courts, and by the very wealthy. The literate population of Europe was small, partly because literacy required access to texts, and texts were scarce, and scarcity kept the literate class small, which kept the production of texts limited, which kept the scarcity entrenched. It was a loop that had been running for 1,000 years and that nobody had found a way to break. Gutenberg broke it. A printing press could produce a copy of a book in a fraction of the time a scribe required. It could produce not one copy but hundreds, at roughly the same total labor cost as producing a single handwritten copy. The price of books collapsed. Not immediately, not all at once, but within decades of Gutenberg's press beginning operation around 1450, the economics of text production had been permanently transformed. Printers competed with each other on price. The cost of a printed book fell to perhaps 1/20th of the cost of a handwritten one. Books that had previously been accessible only to monasteries and princes became accessible to merchants, to craftsmen, to anyone who could read and could afford what was now a consumer product rather than a luxury object. By 1500, 50 years after Gutenberg's press began operation, an estimated 20 million books were in circulation across Europe. By 1600, that number had risen to roughly 200 million. To understand what this means, consider that the entire handwritten manuscript tradition of medieval Europe, accumulated over 1,000 years of monastic and scholarly copying, had produced perhaps several million surviving manuscripts. The printing press produced more text in its first 50 years than the scribal tradition had produced in 10 centuries. But here is the thing about a technology that floods a society with text. It does not flood that society with any particular kind of text. It floods it with everything, with theology and pornography, with scientific observation and astrological superstition, with political philosophy and slander. With the Bible translated into languages that ordinary people could read for the first time, and with pamphlets arguing that the men who ran the church were corrupt, venal, sexually depraved, and deserving of violent overthrow. The printing press did not discriminate. It printed what people would pay to have printed. And what people would pay to have printed in any era is whatever they most urgently need to say to whoever will listen. And what people most urgently needed to say in the early 16th century was that something was wrong, that the church had lost its way, that the men who sold salvation for money were thieves, that the God who had made every human soul did not require a Latin-speaking intermediary to hear their prayers. These were not new ideas. They had been circulating in various forms for over a century. What was new was the mechanism that could take those ideas and put them into the hands of tens of thousands of people within weeks of their being written. Martin Luther understood this mechanism in a way that no one before him had fully grasped, and his understanding of it represents the single most consequential act of media strategy in the history of Western civilization before the invention of the Internet. Luther's grievances against the Catholic Church were real and substantial. The selling of indulgences, the practice by which the Church offered buyers remission of time in purgatory in exchange for monetary payment, was theologically dubious, financially corrupting, and widely resented. The particular indulgence that triggered Luther was being sold by Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar working on behalf of Pope Leo X, to raise money for the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Tetzel's sales pitch was legendary for its crudeness. He reportedly told buyers that the moment a coin clinked in the collection box, a soul leaped from purgatory into heaven. The Pope needed a building. The dead needed redemption. Tetzel provided the transaction. Luther found this obscene. The Church's insistence on conducting all religious services in Latin, a language that the vast majority of the laity did not understand, had created a permanent professional class of clergy serving as necessary intermediaries between ordinary believers and their God. The wealth of the church hierarchy, the palaces, the banquets, the political scheming, the children kept openly by bishops and cardinals who had taken public vows of celibacy, contrasted grotesquely with the material poverty and spiritual desperation of the peasants whose tithes funded it all. These were not fringe complaints generated by a handful of malcontents. They were mainstream grievances articulated by serious thinkers across Europe, and they had been building for generations. What previous reformers had lacked was not the argument. Jan Hus, the Bohemian theologian, had made essentially the same arguments against church corruption a century before Luther. He had been burned at the stake for it in 1415 after being guaranteed safe conduct to the Council of Constance and then having that guarantee revoked. His execution was supposed to end the matter. Instead, it produced the Hussite Wars, a series of conflicts between the Bohemian followers of Hus and the Holy Roman Emperor that lasted 15 years and anticipated, in their intensity and their religious logic, what would happen a century later on a continental scale. The Hussites were eventually suppressed. The reform impulse survived underground, waiting for something that could give it scale. That something was the printing press. Luther's 95 Theses, the document he posted on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg on October 31, 1517, which tradition marks as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, were written in Latin and intended for a scholarly theological debate. This is crucial to understand. Luther was not, in October 1517, attempting to start a revolution. He was a professor of theology at a provincial university, posting a document that announced his willingness to defend a set of propositions in academic debate. Posting documents on church doors was a standard academic practice for announcing the willingness to dispute. Luther expected responses from fellow scholars. He expected a conversation among trained theologians who would read Latin, evaluate his arguments carefully, and respond in kind. What he got was something entirely different. Within 2 weeks of posting the theses, someone the historical record does not clearly identify who, though some historians believe it was the printer Jobst Gutknecht, had translated them from Latin into German and sent the translation to a printer. W. Within a month, printed copies were circulating across Germany. Within 2 months, they had reached Rome. Within a year, they had been reprinted in dozens of editions across the German-speaking world, in quantities that collectively numbered in the tens of thousands. A document written for a dozen scholarly readers had become a mass communication event of a kind that had no precedent in human history. Luther recognized immediately what had happened and what it meant. He adapted, faster and more completely than anyone around him recognized was happening. He began writing in German rather than Latin, in the vigorous, earthy, confrontational vernacular of the German street rather than the elevated register of academic theology. He wrote with a directness and an emotional force that the careful language of scholastic debate had never permitted, and that the printing press could now reach directly to an audience of ordinary readers who had never had access to serious religious argument before. He wrote constantly. Between 1517 and 1520, Luther published more texts than any individual had published in the entire history of European printing up to that point. His 3 great reforming treatises of 1520, addressed to the Christian nobility of the German nation, the Babylonian captivity of the Church, and on the freedom of a Christian, were each printed in thousands of copies and circulated across the continent within weeks of their completion. Printers competed to produce his work because his work sold. The market for Luther's writing was large, growing, and commercially enthusiastic in ways that no previous author of religious controversy had ever generated. The Church's response revealed the depth of its institutional confusion about what it was dealing with. A papal bull condemning 41 of Luther's propositions, Ex Surge Domine, issued in June 1520, demanded that Luther recant within 60 days or face excommunication. Luther burned it publicly at the Elster Gate in Wittenberg on December 10, 1520 in front of an audience of faculty and students, and had the event recorded and printed. The Church's traditional mechanisms for suppressing dissent, excommunication, interdict, book burning, the threat of prosecution for heresy, all required that the institution control the flow of information. It had controlled that flow with varying degrees of success for 1,000 years. The printing press had ended that control. You could burn the books in a particular city on a particular day. You could not burn all the books on a continent. You could excommunicate Luther. You could not excommunicate the tens of thousands of readers who had already read his words and whose understanding of Christianity had been permanently altered by them. By 1521, when Luther was summoned before the Diet of Worms, the Imperial Assembly convened by the Emperor Charles V to deal with the theological crisis. He was not merely a theologian with heterodox views. He was a media figure with a mass following across Germany, Scandinavia, and significant portions of Switzerland and the Low Countries. Charles V, who was also King of Spain and ruler of vast territories across Europe and the New World, declared Luther an outlaw. The declaration was printed and distributed. Luther's supporters' accounts of his defiant speech at Worms were also printed and distributed within days of the event, across the German cities where Luther's readers were most concentrated. The phrase attributed to him, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God," may not be historically accurate. It was printed as though it were, and the printing made it true in every sense that mattered for the history that followed. The fracturing of Western Christianity that followed was not orderly. The printing press that enabled Luther enabled every other reformer as well. Zwingli in Zurich developed his own theology, distinct from Luther's on crucial points including the nature of the Eucharist, and printed it. Calvin in Geneva developed a third position and built around it an international Reformed movement with its own printing infrastructure and its own network of trained ministers who could take Calvinist theology into new territories and establish it there. The Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Antitrinitarians, the English separatists who would eventually sail to North America. Each theological position found its printer, its pamphlet tradition, its distribution network, its community of readers who became convinced that this particular version of Christianity was the correct one and all the others were damnable error. The situation was unprecedented in Western history, and it was, from the perspective of anyone trying to maintain political order, genuinely catastrophic. Medieval Europe had managed theological disagreement through institutional authority. The Church decided what was true, and those who disagreed were dealt with through the mechanisms of ecclesiastical and civil power working in coordination. Those mechanisms had worked imperfectly but adequately, because information moved slowly and because the costs of sustained dissent were very high. The printing press changed both conditions simultaneously. Information now moved faster than any censoring authority could effectively respond to it, and the costs of dissent had fallen dramatically, because a printed pamphlet could be produced, distributed, and read before any censoring authority knew it existed. The century between Luther's theses and the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618 was not peaceful. It was a period of continuous religious conflict across Europe. The French Wars of Religion, which killed perhaps 3 million people over 40 years, the Dutch Revolt against Spanish rule, which lasted 80 years, the English Reformation and its successive reversals under Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, the persecution of Protestants in Spain and Italy, the persecution of Catholics in England and Scotland. Each of these conflicts had its own specific political and economic dimensions, but all of them ran on the fuel that the printing press provided, an inexhaustible supply of theological argument, atrocity narrative, political polemic, and eschatological urgency that kept populations engaged, outraged, and convinced that their cause was righteous and the other side was literally the instrument of Satan. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was an attempt to manage the situation within the existing political framework. Its principle, cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, gave rulers the authority to determine the official religion of their territories and permitted subjects who disagreed to emigrate rather than be forcibly converted. It was a compromise that satisfied almost no one and resolved nothing fundamental. It recognized the impossibility of restoring unity but provided no framework for permanent coexistence. And it excluded from its protections the Calvinist Reformed tradition that was growing rapidly across Germany, creating a category of believers who were not covered by the peace and who had every reason to press for a revision of its terms. The printing presses kept running through all of this. The argument kept intensifying. And on a May morning in 1618, a group of Protestant Bohemian nobles walked into Prague Castle and threw 3 Catholic imperial officials out of a third-floor window. The defenestration of Prague, the third in the city's history, which tells you something about Bohemian political culture, was the spark. All 3 officials survived the fall of roughly 15 meters, which both sides interpreted as confirmation of their own theological position. The Catholics said God had miraculously protected his servants. The Protestants said they had landed in a dung heap, and that was its own commentary. The political meaning of the act was unambiguous. The Bohemian Protestant nobility was rejecting the authority of the incoming Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, who had made his determination to reverse the Protestant gains of the previous century clear enough that the Bohemians felt they had no choice but to resist. The pamphlet wars that accompanied the military conflicts of the 30 Years' War were conducted with exactly the same ferocity and the same printing infrastructure as the wars themselves. Both sides produced detailed illustrated accounts of atrocities committed by the enemy, massacres of civilians, desecrations of churches, violations of women and children, that were designed to sustain popular anger and prevent any settlement that might look like compromise. The illustrated broadside was the mass medium of the era, and it was used with sophisticated propagandistic intent by every faction in the conflict. When the city of Magdeburg was sacked by imperial forces in 1631 and somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 of its inhabitants were killed, the single greatest atrocity of the entire war, the presses of the Protestant cities had printed accounts of it and distributed them across Europe within weeks. The sack of Magdeburg became a recruiting tool, a justification for Swedish intervention, a permanent symbol of Catholic imperial brutality that sustained the Protestant cause for years afterward. Consider what the printing press had made structurally possible in a way that had not existed before. A battle fought in Bohemia in 1620 could be reported, interpreted, and distributed to audiences in Hamburg and Amsterdam and London within weeks. The interpretation, which army was fighting for God, which was the instrument of the devil, was supplied by pamphleteers who were not neutral observers, but participants in an information war as intense and consequential as the military one. Public opinion, in the modern sense of a mass audience with shared access to a common body of text and a shared emotional investment in a distant conflict, existed. For the first time in the 30 Years' War, the printing press had created the mechanism by which ordinary people who would never go near a battlefield could nonetheless feel personally implicated in what happened there, could feel that their own souls and the souls of their children were at stake in the outcomes of battles fought hundreds of miles away. There is a figure from this war who puts a human face on what the printing press had ultimately produced after 170 years of operation. His name was Hans Heberl, and he was a shoemaker in the city of Ulm. Heberl kept a diary across the entire length of the war, a detailed, sometimes agonizing account of what it meant to be a civilian caught inside a religious conflict he had not chosen and could not escape. He recorded the price of bread during sieges, the passage of armies through the surrounding countryside, the deaths of neighbors from plague and starvation, the 30 separate occasions on which he and his family fled their city to escape approaching armies. 30 times. The same man with his family running from violence that the theological arguments of printed pamphlets had helped generate and sustain. Heberl could read. He was literate in a way that his great-grandfather probably was not, because the printing press had made texts cheaper and literacy more economically valuable. He read the printed accounts of the war as it happened around him. He understood from those accounts the theological stakes that the powerful men on both sides claimed were being contested. And he ran from burning villages anyway 30 times because the printed arguments of theologians and princes were an abstraction and the soldiers outside the city walls were not. His diary sits now in an archive in Ulm. It is one of the most important documents in the history of this period precisely because it records what the printing press's consequences looked like from the ground level, from the perspective of a literate ordinary person who had absorbed the printed argument and who was living inside its results. What finally ended the war was not military victory, because there was no military victory. What ended it was the exhaustion of everyone involved. The exhaustion of populations that had been bled by 30 years of fighting, famine, and plague, and the exhaustion of rulers who had spent their treasuries and their armies and had begun to calculate that peace, even a deeply unsatisfying peace that left fundamental questions unresolved, was less expensive than more war. The Peace of Westphalia, negotiated in the German cities of Osnabrück and Münster over several years, and finally signed in October 1648, was the most important diplomatic achievement of the 17th century. It recognized what the 30 Years' War had proven at enormous cost, that religious disagreement in a world with a printing press could not be suppressed by force, and that political order had to be built on a different foundation. That different foundation was the concept of state sovereignty, the principle that each political entity had the right to determine its own internal arrangements without external interference, and that states were formally equal under international law regardless of their size, their power, or their religious character. The Peace of Westphalia did not resolve the theological disputes that had generated the war. It accepted that those disputes were unresolvable and built a framework within which unresolved disputes could coexist without producing total war. It was, in a very real sense, the first modern international order, a system based not on shared religious truth but on shared rules for managing disagreement. Every subsequent development in international law and relations, the concept of national sovereignty invoked to resist foreign interference, the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states, the formal equality of states under international law regardless of their internal arrangements, traces its intellectual lineage directly to Westphalia. The international order within which every country in the world currently operates was designed, in its fundamental architecture, as a response to the problem that the printing press had created, the problem of irresolvable disagreement at mass scale, and the question of how political order can be maintained when enforced consensus is no longer possible. Now trace the chain one more time because the full length of it is the point. Gutenberg builds a press to copy books for profit. The press makes text cheap. Cheap text expands literacy. Expanded literacy expands the audience for printed argument. Luther writes theological arguments that the press distributes at a scale that makes them impossible to suppress. The impossibility of suppression makes religious disagreement permanent. Permanent religious disagreement produces a century of religious conflict. The conflict produces Peace of Westphalia. Westphalia establishes the concept of national sovereignty that still organizes international relations today. A goldsmith's debt problem in 1440 eventually produced the framework within which every modern state exists and every international interaction is conducted. That is the chain. Every link in it follows causally from the one before it. None of it was intended by anyone, all of it happened. Gutenberg died in 1468, in debt, his press having been legally seized by the financial backer who had funded its development. He died before any of the consequences of what he had built became apparent. He died before the first Luther pamphlet, before the first religious war, before the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia and the modern international order and the nation-state system that currently governs the world. He died before any of it, having built the machine that produced all of it, having made no particular provision for what his machine might do. The first major project his press undertook was the production of the Gutenberg Bible. The second major commercial project, almost certainly, was the printing of Indulgences, the very documents whose sale Luther would condemn 60 years later, whose condemnation set off the chain of events that would kill 11 million people and reshape the world. Gutenberg's press printed the Indulgences. Gutenberg's press printed the pamphlets that destroyed the institution that sold them. The machine was neutral, it printed everything. We live inside a version of this story right now. The specific technology is different. The speed is orders of magnitude greater. The scale is global rather than continental. But the dynamic is identical. A technology that collapses the cost of producing and distributing text to near zero, that makes it possible for anyone with a keyboard to reach a global audience, that floods every society with argument and counterargument and atrocity, narrative and theological urgency and political polemic, that generates disagreements faster than any institution can manage them, and that resists every attempt at censorship or control because the text, once distributed, cannot be recalled. The pamphleteers of the 16th and 17th centuries would recognize exactly what is happening in the digital information environment of the 21st. The speed is different. The platforms are different. The specific content of the argument is different. But the underlying structure, cheap, fast, infinitely replicable text producing argument, argument producing polarization, polarization producing conflict, conflict resisting resolution because the information environment keeps reproducing the conditions that generated it, is the same structure that ran from Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz to the killing fields of Central Europe to the negotiating chambers of Westphalia. We have not yet had our Peace of Westphalia. We have not yet exhausted ourselves into the recognition that the disagreements the new technology amplifies cannot be resolved by force, and that we need a new framework for political order that can accommodate irresolvable difference at global scale. We are perhaps 80 years into our version of this story, which is roughly where Europe was in 1530. Past the initial shock of the new technology, past the first wave of conflict it generated, but nowhere near the exhaustion that eventually produces settlement. The 30 Years' War ended because everyone ran out of men and money. The question of what digital conflict exhausts, what runs out, and when, and whether the thing that runs out is men and money or something more fundamental and less replenishable, is still open. The museum in Mainz where Gutenberg's original press is displayed is a modest building in a modest German city. The press itself is smaller than you expect. It does not look like the thing that changed everything. It looks like a piece of furniture. Tourists photograph it and move on. Most of them do not know what they are looking at. They are looking at the machine that started an argument that is still running. They should probably sit with it for longer than they do. There is a dimension of the printing press story that the grand narrative of Reformation and war tends to obscure, and it involves the people who actually operated the presses, the printers themselves, who were neither reformers nor imperial loyalists but commercial operators navigating the most dangerous media environment in European history. Being a printer in 16th century Europe was among the most politically precarious occupations imaginable. If you printed material that the authorities found objectionable, you could be arrested, your equipment seized, your business destroyed, and in extreme cases you could be executed. If you refused to print material that powerful patrons wanted distributed, you lost income and possibly protection. And the difficulty was that the material that authorities found most objectionable was often also the material that readers most wanted, which meant that the material most likely to make your fortune was also the material most likely to end your freedom. The printers who produced Luther's pamphlets in the early years of the Reformation took significant personal risks. Some were arrested. Some had their shops raided. Some were forced to flee cities where the authorities were hostile to the Reformation and resettle in cities where the political climate was more tolerant. The geographic distribution of printing houses across German-speaking Europe was shaped not only by commercial factors, but by the political geography of religious tolerance. Printers clustered in cities whose rulers were sympathetic to the Reformation because those cities were safer places to produce the material that sold best. But here is the detail that complicates any simple narrative of brave printers serving the cause of reform. Many of the same printers who produced Luther's works also produced Catholic propaganda if the price was right. Commercial printing was a business. Ideology was sometimes a factor in what a printer chose to produce. Commercial calculation was always a factor. The printing industry of the 16th century was not, in the main, a movement. It was a market and it served whatever demand existed on whatever side of the religious conflict that demand arose. This commercial dimension of early printing is important because it points towards something that the idealistic narrative of the Reformation as a triumph of truth over institutional authority tends to obscure. The printing press did not spread Luther's ideas because Luther's ideas were true and truth has a natural tendency to propagate itself. The printing press spread Luther's ideas because Luther's ideas were commercially successful, because people bought pamphlets about them in large numbers, which made those pamphlets profitable to print, which created strong incentives for printers to produce more of them. The market for religious controversy was enormous, and the market did not distinguish between ideas that were correct and ideas that were commercially compelling. This is not a cynical point. It is an important one. The same mechanism that distributed Luther's genuine theological insights also distributed theological positions that were, by any reasonable assessment, less well-grounded. The same mechanism that spread the Reformation spread the Counter-Reformation, the Anabaptist Revolution, millenarian prophecies of imminent apocalypse, astrological predictions, witch-hunting manuals, and an enormous range of material that we would now describe as misinformation. The printing press amplified everything with equal indifference to its quality. It was, in this sense, precisely the kind of technology that rewards the compelling over the correct, the emotionally engaging over the careful, the simple outrage over the complex analysis. The witch trials that swept Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, claiming an estimated 40 to 60,000 lives, with some estimates running higher, were enabled by print in ways that historians have documented extensively. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting manual published in 1487 by the Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, was one of the early printing press's bestsellers. Between its publication and 1520, it went through 14 editions. Between 1574 and 1669, it went through 16 more. The manual provided a theological framework for understanding witchcraft, a legal framework for prosecuting it, and a practical guide for extracting confessions from the accused. Its wide distribution created a standardized template for witch trials across different jurisdictions and different countries, contributing to the systematic nature of the persecution. Before the printing press, witch prosecutions had been local, inconsistent, and limited in scale. After the printing press distributed the Malleus and similar texts, they became something closer to a coordinated campaign. The printing press that spread Luther's arguments about salvation also spread Kramer's arguments about diabolical conspiracy. Both were commercially successful publications. Both shaped the intellectual environment of the 16th and 17th centuries in profound and lasting ways. Neither outcome was intended by Gutenberg, who died 2 decades before either book appeared. The Scientific Revolution, which unfolded across the same period as the Reformation and the religious wars, is the third major output of the printing press that tends to be taught separately from the other two, but cannot be fully understood in isolation from them. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Brahe, Harvey, Vesalius, the figures who transformed the European understanding of the natural world in the 16th and 17th centuries, were all working in a world structured by the printing press. Their ability to build on each other's work, to access observations and arguments produced by researchers in different cities and different countries, to establish a cumulative body of knowledge that each generation could inherit and extend, depended on the printing press in the same fundamental way that Luther's ability to reach a mass audience had depended on it. Harvey's discovery of the circulation of blood, published in 1628, was available to physicians across Europe within years of its publication. Galileo's astronomical observations, published in the Sidereus Nuncius in 1610, were reprinted and discussed across the continent within months. The speed of information exchange among the natural philosophers of the 17th century was orders of magnitude faster than what had been possible in the manuscript tradition. And that speed was crucial to the accelerating pace of discovery that characterizes the scientific revolution as a historical period. The same printing press that distributed the Malleus Maleficarum also distributed Vesalius's revolutionary anatomy text with its detailed illustrations of the human body. The same printing press that distributed inflammatory religious pamphlets that sustained the 30 Years' War also distributed Kepler's mathematical description of planetary orbits. The technology was neutral in a way that its effects were not. It made everything faster and wider and more permanent, and what was made faster and wider and more permanent was the full range of what human beings wanted to communicate, the sublime and the murderous and the brilliant and the hateful, all with equal mechanical efficiency. The 30 Years' War and the Scientific Revolution are usually taught as separate subjects in separate courses, because they seem to belong to different categories of history, political religious history on one side, intellectual history on the other. But they are not separate. They are simultaneous products of the same technological transformation, running in parallel, interacting with each other in ways that shaped the outcome of both. A Europe that was fracturing along religious lines was a Europe in which the Church's intellectual authority was being challenged at the same moment as its theological authority. The arguments about what Christians should believe were running simultaneously with the arguments about what the natural world actually was. Both were being conducted in print. Both were producing irresolvable disagreement. Both were contributing to the sense that the old certainties about salvation, about the cosmos, about the nature of legitimate authority were no longer secure. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 resolved the political crisis that the printing press had generated in the religious domain. It provided no resolution to the intellectual crisis it had generated in the domain of natural philosophy. That resolution came a generation later with the establishment of the scientific academies, the Royal Society in London in 1660, the Académie des Sciences in Paris in 1666, which created institutional frameworks for adjudicating disputes about the natural world. The peer review process, the experiment as the court of appeal, the publication of findings in a common language accessible to all natural philosophers regardless of their national or religious affiliation. These were mechanisms for managing intellectual disagreement in a world saturated with print. They were, in their domain, doing what the Peace of Westphalia had done in the political domain, building a framework for coexistence and productive exchange among people who disagreed fundamentally about important things. The printing press required, in every domain it touched, the development of new institutions capable of managing the flood of information and argument it produced. In religion, the answer was the confessional state and eventually the principle of toleration. In politics, the answer was the sovereign state and the law of nations. In natural philosophy, the answer was the scientific academy and the experimental method. Each of these institutional innovations was, in its way, a Peace of Westphalia, a recognition that irresolvable disagreement was the permanent condition of a world with a printing press, and that the task was not to resolve it but to manage it. We have not yet built the equivalent institutions for the Internet. The platforms that currently structure the digital information environment are commercial enterprises optimized for engagement, which in practice means optimized for the emotional intensity that produces clicks and shares and advertising revenue. They are not designed to manage disagreement. They are designed to amplify it, because amplified disagreement produces more engagement than settled consensus. In this respect, they are closer to the unregulated pamphlet market of the 16th century than to the Royal Society of the 17th, closer to the mechanism that produced the 30 Years' War than to the mechanism that eventually found a way past it. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an observation about where we are in a story that has a historical precedent. The precedent is not comforting. The precedent involves 11 million dead and 30 years of devastation, but it does have an ending. The ending involved exhaustion and pragmatism and the construction of new institutions capable of managing what the technology had made permanently unmanageable by force. That ending is available to us. It is not guaranteed, but it is available. Gutenberg's press is in a museum in Mainz. It is smaller than you expect. It looks like a piece of furniture. Most people who photograph it have no idea they are looking at the device that made the modern world possible, and that nearly destroyed the civilization in which the modern world was built. The argument it started is still running. It will not stop. The only question that matters is whether we build, before it exhausts us completely, the institutions capable of living with it. There is one final piece of the Gutenberg story that almost nobody knows, and it changes how the whole thing feels. Gutenberg did not work alone. The development of the printing press was funded by a wealthy Mainz merchant named Johann Fust, who provided Gutenberg with a series of loans totaling roughly 1,600 guilders, an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to several years' income for a skilled craftsman, to fund the development and operation of the press. The relationship between Gutenberg and Fust was a partnership formalized in contract that gave Fust significant financial claims on the press and its output. In 1455, Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment of the loans plus compound interest. He won. The court awarded him the press, the equipment, and the printed materials that represented the accumulated output of Gutenberg's workshop. Gutenberg lost his invention to his financial backer. The first major product of the press, the Gutenberg Bible, which was in press when the lawsuit was resolved, was completed and sold by Fust and his son-in-law Peter Schurfer, who had been working in Gutenberg's shop and who now took over the operation. Gutenberg received nothing from the Gutenberg Bible. He received nothing from the thousands of other products that presses built on his design would go on to produce. He spent the last years of his life operating a second, smaller printing operation funded by a different patron, working in relative obscurity in a city that contained the workshop from which his life's work had been taken. When he died in 1468, he was largely unknown. His name did not appear on any of the products his press had produced, because printers of the era did not customarily identify themselves on title pages. The man who invented the printing press died without receiving credit for it from his contemporaries and without receiving any financial benefit from the commercial empire that his invention had created. He was rehabilitated by history only gradually, as scholars pieced together the documentary record of who had actually built the press and what it had taken to do so. The celebration of Gutenberg as one of the most consequential inventors in human history is largely a product of the 19th century, when the 500th anniversary of the press's invention prompted a systematic reassessment of his contribution. By then, the press had already produced the Reformation, the religious wars, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, and was well on its way to producing the modern newspaper, the modern novel, and the entire infrastructure of literate commercial civilization. None of which Gutenberg saw, none of which he could have imagined, all of which began in his workshop with a problem about how to cast metal type that would hold ink properly. The technologies that change everything are rarely recognizable as world historical events when they are happening. They look like engineering problems. They look like dead arrangements. They look like a goldsmith trying to find a commercially viable application for a skill set he had spent years developing. The people who live through transformative technological moments mostly experience them as a series of practical challenges to be solved, not as pivots in the history of civilization. Gutenberg solved his practical challenges. The pivot happened anyway. And it is still happening. That is the point. The argument that the press started has not ended. The institutions that the argument eventually forced into existence are still evolving, still inadequate to the scale of what they are supposed to manage, still being rebuilt in real time as the information environment keeps changing underneath them. The museum in Mainz is open to visitors 6 days a week. The press is behind glass. The Gutenberg Bible is on display in an adjacent room. Its pages illuminated by lights designed to prevent the paper from fading further than it already has. The paper is still holding. The argument it helped start is not behind glass. It is everywhere. It is this. It is every conversation happening right now in every language in every country about what is true and who has the right to say so and what should be done about people who say things that other people believe are wrong and dangerous. Gutenberg did not start that argument. Human beings started it somewhere in the deep past, the first time two people disagreed about something important and each believed themselves to be right. What Gutenberg did was give the argument a machine. And the machine has been running ever since.